Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sigrid Schmalzer, a faculty member in the UMass Amherst History Department and a member of the organizing committee for this year's Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's launch of the Feinberg Spring Semester programming. Offered every other year by the History Department, the series is focusing this year on the theme, What Are Universities For? Struggles for the Soul of Higher Education. The various events explore the roots of the political, economic, and ethical crises in higher education today. On behalf of the department, college, and university, I extend our gratitude to the esteemed attorney and UMass history alumnus, Kenneth Feinberg, whose generosity makes the series possible. I also thank the faculty and staff in the history department who organized this year's series and the 36 academic partners who co-sponsored it. Before going any further, a few notes. Live closed captioning is available over Zoom. Please consult the chat for instructions on how to enable it. If you are a student attending as part of a course, please sign in via the link we will post in the chat. Due to the number of people in attendance, participation in the chat has been restricted. However, you may at any point during the course of the event submit questions for the speakers via the QA tool. The moderator will be collecting questions and introducing as many as possible to the conversation. I invite everyone to visit the Feinberg Series website, www.umass.edu/Feinberg, for recordings of this fall's events and to register for the forthcoming events, which include a film screening and panel on student debt and the crisis of global capitalism, a student-curated exhibit called Be Revolutionary on UMass student efforts to end CIA recruitment on campus in the 1980s, and the annual James Baldwin Lecture to be delivered by Stephen Saleta. Today, we are proud to host From Land Grab to Native Sovereignty, Indigenous Futures at Land-Grant Universities, a dynamic conversation between two leading researchers on colonialism and decolonization in the United States. Tristan Ahtone of Grist magazine and Wayne Yang, a.k.a. a paperson of the University of California, San Diego, will engage in an expansive dialogue on the historical and present-day relationships of U.S. universities to Indigenous peoples, reflecting on how universities can be accountable to the land and to Indigenous peoples. Ahtone will build on his work in land grab universities and misplaced trust to discuss the connections between universities, Indigenous land, and climate change, with land-grant universities profiting from fossil fuels, mining, and other industries on land stolen from Indigenous nations. Author of A Third University is Possible and co-author of Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor, Yang will explore how universities can recognize and respect Native sovereignty, including through free enrollment for Native students, rematriation of land, and Indigenous community-driven action research. The conversation, including opportunities for audience engagement, will be facilitated by Abigail Chabitnoy, award-winning poet and faculty at the Institute of American Indian Arts and the UMass English Department. We will drop their full bios in the chat for your reference, along with links to their work. On behalf of this year's Feinberg Organizing Committee, I acknowledge that UMass Amherst is located on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. Inspired by this year's focus on the role of higher education in society and by the contributions of tonight's speakers, we encourage you to join us in considering our university's contributions to Indigenous land dispossession, as well as the carbon pollution, war, and other forms of violence that continue to kill, impoverish, and make refugees of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities around the world. We also recognize the university's enormous capacity to help solve these problems. The series is an invitation to us all to reflect on these questions and to get involved in collective movements for justice and repair. And now, please welcome tonight's moderator, Professor Abigail Chabitnoy.
Tamai, Koyana, Sacred. Hui Abigail Chabitnoy, Pennsylvania mi Shulianga. Mamaka Valerie, Pennsylvania mi Shulia. Tataka Robert, Pennsylvania mi Shulia. Ilanka Tani Hamek, Charlie Ungamek, Charlie Germany mute. I am fortunate to be able to, perhaps painfully, introduce myself in my Sukston language, which I am learning through poetry as sort of an excuse for that time. But I'd like to preface this conversation, in addition to welcoming you all, I'd like to preface this conversation and some of the questions that will follow with the transparency that I am an Indigenous poet, specifically an Unangan and Supiaq poet. As a result of the United States genocidal boarding school policies, namely, in this case, the Carlisle Indian School, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, removed from the traditional homelands of the Aleutian Islands and southwestern Alaska that, despite my dislocation, continue to pull me. My main area of study, practice, and teaching is poetry, which has pulled me into conversations surrounding, as well as the teaching of Indigenous literature, mostly from this practitioner point of view, which is how I end up moderating a history lecture series. However, I would be remiss in not acknowledging that my family also descends from Germanic roots, which I reflect in my Sukhstun introduction. And while my poetic practice has largely been shaped by the relationship of responsibility and belonging I have sought to reestablish with my homelands and Unangan Supiaq relatives, I am as much a product of Western patriarchal capitalist culture and have as much culpability and responsibility as a settler as I have a responsibility to my Indigenous community. Those checkboxes on demographic questionnaires don't come close to the heart of the matter. But what I appreciate about poetry and about Indigenous ways of knowing as I have implemented them in my daily practice is this room for a dynamic flexibility, a fluidity and presence that reflects the complexity of real relational living, that makes room for yes and rather than either or. I also want to acknowledge that I, for one, was caught off guard the first time I was on a panel and a fellow participant clarified that they did indeed mean land back in a literal sense. I thought impossible. That land is gone. Not that I didn't support the sentiment, but the first time I sported my Honor the Treaties shirt at home, my dad shrugged it off with a resigned chuckle and an offhand, too late. The first time I heard a land acknowledgement, I admit I thought it was a great start. Not only did I not learn of the very different experiences of colonization in Alaska, aside of the colonization of the lower 48, I learned nothing of the Indigenous peoples still living in the eastern portion of the country. Words like Delaware and Susquehanna were daily reminders, but only if you knew their reference, which received maybe a week of lessons involving making paper bag and toothpick porcupine vests or construction paper feather headbands every November, and a swift sweep under the rug at best. Here at least, was acknowledgement of Indigenous resistance. These lands were unceded and continued Indigenous presence. The risk of understanding decolonization as metaphor, as Wayne Young has written against and we'll hear more about, is that this statement is the beginning and end of the land-grant university's responsibility for reparations in many cases, with little good faith effort at consequent action. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's walk it back to make sure we're all understanding the terms of the conversation by welcoming Tristan and Wayne to the screen.
Hello. Thanks for the cue, Abigail. Hi, Tristan.
Hi, Wayne.
Shemai, hello and welcome. So I've written up some questions to kick things off in respect of the desire for this to be more of a conversation than a formal lecture, but I'm happy to take your lead on where you'd like the conversation to go. Perhaps the best place to start might be with giving some background on your respective positions that you approach this subject through. So Tristan, would you like to give a brief introduction to your work, the history of land-grant universities, and why it is perhaps that some people have come to call them land-grab universities? And tied to this, because I think it's also, as we've discussed, important that we're grounding this conversation where it matters. I think also an important framing is what it means to be in relationship to these lands and communities.
Sure. I'll try to answer all of that. First, thanks for inviting me to be here, and thank you to the Feinberg series for organizing this talk. I'm really excited to be here. I think if we're for folks that are seeing me for the first time, I'm a reporter. I am editor at large at Grist. We're a nonprofit news outlet focused on climate, and I run our Indigenous affairs desk. So I'm coming at this from the background of a reporter, specifically as an investigative reporter. You know, in terms of your question to Abigail about sort of like background and why many of these institutions are called land grab universities. The name really comes from an investigative story that we released in 2020 in the nonprofit magazine High Country News. And the title of the story was Land Grab Universities. And it was focused specifically on the impacts of the Morrill Act of 1862, which established the land grant university system. So for audience members that may not be familiar with mid-19th century land laws, the Morrill Act was one of the sort of like three big headliner laws, two of which folks may be more familiar with, the Railroad Act and the Homestead Act. So essentially, if cliff notes here on what the Morrill Act did, basically it promised states between 90,000 and 990,000 acres of land, essentially depending on the size of their congressional delegations. And once those states got that land, they could sell it to raise funds for new colleges. So hence the name land grant colleges. Where I think essentially I come in and my team comes in is we wanted to look at where the land came from. And no surprise, it's indigenous land and territory that's being acquired by the United States and turned into these gifts of land for these land grant institutions. And essentially what we found in our investigation was that there were essentially 160 violence-backed treaties, which netted almost 11 million acres of land from 250 indigenous nations. That land was then distributed to 52 land-grant universities, most of which sold that land off for about $500 million in profit when adjusted for inflation. And if you could pull up the photos, you can kind of see sort of how specific we were able to get with our research. And there you go. These acres, since almost all of them were sold off, really do form sort of the landscape of America. And the images in particular here are in California and were sold for universities like Auburn University, University of California, MIT, and the University of Massachusetts. So I think for folks that are semi-familiar with land grant universities, it's sort of a common misconception that these grants were used only for campuses, but the grants were really about as big or bigger than most major cities. They're often located hundreds or even thousands of miles away from their beneficiaries. And the end goal was to provide education for the masses and really fuel economic growth to support Western expansion. And I guess I'll just leave this here for the conversation. This really is the idea of Western expansion that's like driving these conversations about taking land from tribes and gifting it to states and institutions. So in the historical records about passing the Morrill Act, you'll find the act sponsor, Vermont Senator Justin Morrill, really encouraging his colleagues to use the United States, quote, like Western empire amassed through her triumphs over the savage to fund his bill and jumpstart the land grant system. And so I think that's really our starting point on why they've sort of earned the name of land grab university.
Thank you. Yes, certainly a lot more that we'll want to get into and talk about, but I'd also like to invite Wayne to enter in here with how you would position your background and work into this conversation and how it relates to critiques of land grab universities and a fostering of Native sovereignty in higher education.
Yeah, thank you so much. And echoing Tristan, I'm just very honored to be part of this conversation today. And thanks to all the people on the webinar. Wow, we got quite a few folks. So thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I think I just want to comment, like we had images of land that of places that were running in the background. if you want to bring those back up, that'd be great. It doesn't, I'm not going to comment on each one, but I think Tristan, I'll say I am an academic, haven't always been one, so I'm not only an academic, but I will say Tristan could easily be an academic, and your team could easily be tenured professors, faculty at a university with the kind of research you've done, but also like the analytics. So like those maps that you saw in the beginning, like incredible work where all those lines draw from a university to all the land that funds that university. So you'll see University of Massachusetts on there, and I think University of Massachusetts reaches to California. So these images I asked Tristan if we could include images of California, because in a very, I would say, indigenous journalistic way, in a very loving way, they looked for these actual locations where these parcels of land were bought and sold and funded universities. So, you know, it's similar to buying and selling people, right? This is people's homelands and the people's kin, and here they are now. So in terms of my research on there is not, it's actually more limited than anything that High Country News and Tristan's group and these folks have done at Land Grab U. But I think I was really struck by how something, actually Tristan said it, universities aren't built on land, they're built out of land, right? They're the same way our universities are built on enslaved labor, free and enslaved labor. These are the motors for our educational institutions. And these are the motors for this country, this motor for capitalism. And this has been the motor for wealth. And the wealth, of course, is not only not equally distributed, but it's actually at the extraction of indigenous, in this case, indigenous people and lands. So this wealth is built on that. So leading to, I think, the question of today, and I'll kind of end my bit here is, what are universities good for? What can they do, right? And what are they good for is also kind of like the sense of obligation. Like, so what is this promise good for? How are we going to make good on it? And I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's sort of where, where my interests lie is what can we do with these institutions that we've inherited, with these countries we've inherited, with these circumstances we've inherited, and how can we dream differently? Meaning, like, how can we honor and I will say it here, indigenous dreams of the future that have always been in place? Like, how do we play our part in enacting that vision? And so that's why I'm here today. Thanks.
Yeah, it's so stunning to see these photos and these maps, thinking too about how we so commonly abstract land into this commodity and kind of an out of sight, out of mind, or a way of accruing wealth, and to see the sort of progression from viewing land as homeland, as kin, to seeing the empty lots or the intersections or the kind of tract of land next to a trailer, and to see the sort of continued presence of that land and really highlight its continued being in terms of what might have been lost, or what kind of obligations were the sort of cost of these lands. And so perhaps that's somewhere we could start to really dig into, is how you see land grant universities' present day relationships to Indigenous communities and how these lands are used. I'm thinking simultaneously as I'm saying this of whether or not we've established really the heart of how these land grant universities have come to be and what those obligations stem from. Tristan, you used the term 160 violence-backed treaties. And I'm thinking also about conversations I've had in recent literature courses about the Black Hills and that kind of open case of reparations. And I'm wondering really if we could dig into this notion of the obligation of universities and where that obligation is coming from. So often when we talk about Native American schools, the funding of tribal colleges, or the funding of Native health clinics and some goods and services that are on Native communities, we forget that these are not gifts. These are not acts of charities. This is payment for land that one could argue was not really bought, but that's sort of the terminology, that transaction of this is meant to be in perpetuity of land that was in one way or another wrestled from the indigenous peoples that were there. I can rephrase that as a question if I sort of went too much off tangent. But I'm really just thinking about if we've framed the idea of just where this obligation comes from a legal framework, and perhaps the sort of wiggle room between what the letter of the law calls for and what the sort of moral obligation to universities might be.
I mean, I guess I could start, although I think Wayne would probably do a better job at looking at some of the details and specifics here, because I think I probably come from a slightly more binary kind of look at these institutions, mainly through just my work as a reporter. I mean, I think mainly when I'm thinking about the work that we do around this topic, and thinking about sort of the receipts that we've been able to pull together around reporting on land grant institutions. You know, I mean, on some level, I look at this as very transactional. And the reason I look at this as transactional is because I need the audience to be able to see those transactions happening, and I need to be able to sort of like show the mechanics of how land, more or less wealth transfer moves, because this is ultimately a story about wealth transfer, in my opinion. So, you know, when it comes to sort of like what are the obligations of a land grant university, I mean, on one level, I think it's very easy for me to say, like, well, I mean, one obligation would be to sort of make tribes whole again for land that they profited off of, right? Maybe that's and I think the best way to do that is likely through some form of land return or land return program. You know, I think that's a very it's easier said than done, obviously, but you know, this is why we have universities, so we can dream about those kind of ideas, and so we can think about those critically, so we can have the structures in place that allow us to sort of think critically about what kind of a future that we want. So I think that would be sort of maybe one of the big obligations, I would say, and there are many that land grant universities have when it comes to sort of dealing with this history, is thinking about that history and thinking about what kind of future those institutions want, and making sure that the pieces are in place to reach those futures. But Wayne, I'm sure you can talk more about this.
No, thank you for saying that. I love that phrase, make tribes whole again. I mean, I think fundamentally it is, you know, I think people are afraid to think about land back because they can only think it's property back, right? It's not the return of relationships, the return of tribes, the whole holistic nature of indigenous life and land in those relationships. And which is, you know, I'm part of this group called the Indigenous Futures Institute, and people are always like, what's an indigenous future? Whose future? And it's like, which tribe, right? And the thing is, it's the indigenous future is the future the planet was meant to have, right? It's the future we were all meant to live. It's the future that was meant to be. And so in a sense, an indigenous future is an inclusive future. It's a future for all of us. And so when you say make tribes whole again, or you know, universities participating in land return, that is not property return. It's not, it is a restoration of other relationships where, you know, before we were thought of as property, before land was thought of as property. And I think, what does that look like requires our imaginations, requires imaginations on people on this webinar, requires students. All of us can participate in it. I'm lucky to be part of a few land return projects. It used to be an impossibility, and now it's like, oh no, it's just like really cool work, right? That any of us can do. So I think in terms of obligations of university, yeah, like let's talk about the future. but let's talk about a sustainable future, which is an Indigenous future. Another aspect, though, is the transactional one, right? And so something you said, Tristan, about the transfer of wealth, right? And I mean, there's so many stories like that, that some of these Native nations were like the wealthiest, most abundant communities that one could imagine in North America, particularly. I get to work with the Confederate tribes of Lucerne Ohlone in what we call Oakland, California. And that's what they say is they're like, hey, we didn't have songs about deprivation, how hard life was, because we lived in an abundant world. And we'd like to get back to that. So where was I going with this? But in terms of wealth transfer, my colleague and good friend, Teresa Stewart-Ambo at UCLA, and just put her name in here because the captioner did not get all the proper, we couldn't possibly provide all these for the captioner to write down. So she's at UCLA. She is California native, Tongva Payoka Wicham and Tano Otum. And she points out rightly that California Indian, as people, that's the official term, but California Native people the students have paid more than any other person per capita for our universities. And so I think universities can start minimally with free, already paid for education for all the descendants of Native people. Our university sort of does that already, and where I want to gesture towards is something that I think a lot of people are talking about in terms of Indigenous higher education, is that tuition isn't enough, because we know the cost of attendance is mostly housing. And the irony of being, not having housing or having to pay for housing on Native land is a very large one. And so I think one of the things universities need to think about now is not just tuition remission, but providing housing, providing, from that perspective for Native students. So I would say at a minimum, start with the students, but really, how do we imagine returning land to its rightful place, which is to itself, right? To its Indigenous self. Abigail, what do you think?
Yes, I have just been blown away by all of the conversations I've gotten to participate in just the short 3 years that I have been formally in the academy, as it were. And something that well, it relates to what you both said. One, this idea of making the tribes whole, making the people whole. I'm very interested in notions of how to redress the violence and the ruptures to communities, and also painfully aware of how the conversation is also very difficult and complicated to have around land, and land as sort of one synonym for identifying with community, having grown up on the other side of the country from my homelands, and kind of having to grapple with the economic impossibility, at the very least infeasibility maybe, of relocating back to those homelands. As much as I visited them and as much as they continue to haunt my dreamscape, my poetic scape, drive my sort of awareness in my everyday relations with my students, with my homelands, with my pets, with my daughter, all of these values. But what I'm struck by is this particular framing of the conversation of how universities can facilitate this reparation of more than just land, but also Indigenous life, and also thinking in terms of whether or not, in terms of wealth distribution especially, but also if that's the limits of the question as well. We think sometimes if we throw enough money at the problem, we can solve it, or money is sort of the barrier to solving the problem, because universities have to operate. Those costs have blown up over the past few years. But I'm thinking about whether that sort of monetary consolation is enough. Although I loved what you said about using the return of land for housing as a kind of potential both and sort of way of, right, recognizing that it's more than tuition, and also recognizing that it can be land, it can be student housing, and it could potentially be a sort of communal housing. I'm wondering about how we could reconceive of student housing, but how not just for Indigenous students, perhaps more broad community, but something I'm always struck by is how do we support the students once they get here, I guess, is sort of where I'm at now as a Mellon grant hire at UMass, where I'm tasked with bolstering our Native American Indigenous Studies 5 Colleges Consortium. And I was brought in to add Native literature courses and work with this consortium. And it's wonderful. It's great. I love it. But I don't often get Native students in my classroom. So it's also this continued development of literature and coursework for non-Indigenous students, while the focus of the grant is to promote Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous pathways of study. And so I guess I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts, but especially Wayne, in your capacity with the university, of beyond just paying for tuition, which is absolutely a great start, how do we support the students? How do we rethink the universities and what they can do?
Yeah, wonderful question. Yeah, so my friend and the co-director of Indigenous Futures Institute, Che Lowry, I'll put his name in the chat too. He's also an incredible graphic novelist, a Native graphic novelist. So you should check him out. And he's Northern California, so he's Yurok Maidu descent, and he likes to say that, yes, scholarships are one thing because you got to get Native students there. And I actually think getting Native students here would sustain Native faculty. But the reverse is also true. You have to have Native faculty, Native staff, right? And, you know, one thing about this, you know, what you said about land return and housing, I didn't even imagine that, actually. So you imagined something bigger than what I thought. I was just like, oh, you know, they should get like their dorm fee paid, right? But that would be amazing. And you know, this stuff is so new. Like, we think colonization happened like thousands of years ago or something, but it just happened in California. It just barely happened. Like, we're living in it. And what this means is, like, our university is only 70 years old, and it's built on a Marine rifle range, which was an acquisition by the U.S. Marine Corps for World War II, and preparing for wars, and then it got decommissioned. But it got decommissioned back to the Native people. We have more Native tribes than any tribal reservations than any county in the country, and so, you know, we're very young. We're very young at colonization. It hasn't been. It's not as set in stone. And I think that, what does it mean to be Native faculty? That's also why we create Indigenous Futures Institute. Is like, how can you not feel so alone? And what does it mean for Native students when they come to not feel so alone? And that means changing not only who is there, that's a start, but like how we are there, how we are there for Native students, how Native students, Native faculty can be there with each other. But the reason I'm circling back to Chegg is, Chegg is, like what you said in your introduction, he's not from Southern California. And so it's also, for him, he does a lot of work to live to his responsibilities to that area, which is something that we all settlers can learn, is like, how are we responsible to where we are? And so he has pretty deep relationships with a number of tribal organizations and members and leaders. And so, but that also, I think, Chega said, makes him whole, right? So it is moving outside of the university, and bringing in those relationships that sustain Native communities on campus. And I think it transforms settler relationships. Hopefully it'll transform us out of settler relationships to the world. It changes how we understand land. It changes how we understand people. It changes how we understand our obligations. It changes how we understand education. So yeah, so those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I love that, changing how we understand our obligations, because as I said in my intro, I am kind of coming from this dual space of belonging to an Indigenous community, but also very much being raised in a settler framework, in a settler education, settler frame of mind, and what it would look like to imagine not just a sort of recognition of guilt or a recognition of culpability or responsibility, but then what gets left out of the conversation at the national level a lot is moving beyond that guilt to repair a relationship, and the fact that that's not meant to happen by leaving settlers behind. It's meant by carrying forward a new version of community, a new way of seeing community. I think relating to these questions of how we support students is also perhaps tying us back to land grant institutions and those obligations and those resources and that wealth. And again, the conversation happening in a lot of different rooms these days about the future of funding of various humanities endeavors, various higher education endeavors, various research endeavors, right? We can't really have these idealistic conversations without also considering who's going to foot the bill, right? And I'm thinking about, Tristan, your work in talking about connections between universities and Indigenous land and climate change, and assuming that universities take to heart this sort of moral obligation to return in some way the bounty or the benefit from these institutions, what barriers might there be to following through on those commitments, especially as they pertain to climate action? Just how tangled is that web of land grant funding?
Yeah, I guess I'll get to that in a second. I think, but I would just say when it comes to barriers for sort of like thinking of a good future, it's just the limits of imagination. I mean, I know that seems overly like kind of simplistic to say, and we've talked a lot about how we support students, how we think about these institutions and their obligations. I mean, I believe that like higher education should be free. I think that it should be accessible by anybody, anywhere on the planet, to be able to pursue the sort of learning that they want to. I think it's possible. There are places in the world where that is the reality. And I think especially in the United States that could be a reality too. But I think again, the limits of imagination are really sort of the thing that prevent that kind of thinking. I mean, I see the same conversation you're having about supporting students, about supporting young Indigenous reporters that are coming into journalism. It's incredibly hard just to find them. It's incredibly hard to keep them in the system. It's incredibly hard to get them, into the work that they really want to be able to do, for roughly all the same reasons that you're describing, and getting somebody to school. And obviously universities play a big role in even getting them into a career also, right? So again, I think when it comes to sort of thinking about those obligations and those futures, I mean, is it in the university's interest to sort of think of a future where like money isn't part of the equation? I don't think that's the case for most of these institutions. I don't think for most institutions, learning is actually the desired outcome. Most of the time it's hedge funds with a school attached to it. And that's not to downplay the work that instructors like yourselves do, because obviously you wouldn't do it if you didn't care. And there's great stuff that comes out of institutions. But, there are the future I do firmly believe, and I know this sounds funny because I'm usually a cynical person in almost every meeting and call that I'm in, but I think the future can be anything that we want it to be. It just requires us to sort of think about it and put into action those ideas, and really have the place to sort of think them through and work out what that could look like in many different ways. But I can say though, in regards to your question about sort of being entangled with climate change, I mean, I talked about earlier the sort of how land-grant universities came to be through the Morrill Act. Some of our most recent work here at Grist has been looking at additional land laws that have given land to universities to support them. One of the big things that we've been looking at is something called state enabling acts. So when before territories could become states, they had to pass enabling acts, and in those enabling acts usually are gifts of land to institutions. Essentially, they're called trust lands, and you've actually I think probably a lot of folks who are watching are actually sort of familiar with these. Whenever you're sort of like flying over the Midwest and you sort of see the like grid system on the ground of like farmlands and everything else, those squares, basically like in those myriad different squares that you're seeing in that grid, there are like trust lands, and essentially like their function is to subsidize public institutions, right? So like when these lands are coming on board, you know, in the late 19th century, they're designed like the Morrill Act lands to be sold to raise capital. But after a while, states essentially realized that they could hold on to them longer, and they could rent them for agriculture, grazing, recreation, etc. And then obviously into the 20th century, state managers sort of realized that natural resource extraction could make a lot more money for these institutions. So oil wells, logging, mining, fracking, etc. Our most recent investigation called Misplaced Trust looks into these trust lands and the relationship with land grant universities. And what we found was it was 14 universities that had about 8 million state trust land acres taken from about 123 tribes. And we'd found that between 2018 and 2022, those lands had produced like $6.7 billion in revenue just for those 14 universities, and most of it from extractive industries. So it really allows us to start looking at the relationship sort of between that, you know, that history, ongoing history of colonialism, you know, the birth of higher education, and then obviously like the role climate change plays in terms of funding these institutions. So, you know, like these are all of these institutions have climate pledges of some sort, but they're making billions of dollars every year off of oil and gas extraction, right? So, you know, we now sort of look at like not only moving from looking at righting historical wrongs and ongoing historical wrongs, but we're also looking at like what are universities trading to provide low cost, quote unquote, low cost education to students by trading on the future of the planet, right? We know that the climate crisis is here, and it's more intense than we thought it would be, and it's getting worse faster than we thought it would be. But we have these institutions that are profiting off of fossil fuels. That raises a lot of questions about what the future is going to look like and what exactly we are trading for it.
Yeah. Can I jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
I mean, I'm glad we brought up climate change because in this idea of trading, because, you know, one of the whole things is like carbon offsets, you trade those, you get away with your crimes by saying, you know, you're buying stoves for somebody somewhere else, right? And but you know, the examples of communities, and this is something that students can do, and we can all be students, is so we can study indigenous approaches to climate change. So like some of the communities that are doing the most sustainable forms of climate, well, resisting climate change, but also adapting to it, are indigenous sovereign communities in the United States. I have a colleague, I'm going to drop her name in the chat, Heather Ponchetti Daly. She's a professor of history, but she teaches a course called Indigenous Approaches to Climate Change, and she looks globally. And we need to all learn these strategies. Like there's people doing it, right? And there's people learning to reduce carbon footprint and build energy sovereignty, build food sovereignty. I mean, it makes sense that communities most interested in sovereignty are doing this throughout the world. She also teaches a course called Indigenous Food Sovereignty. I guess I'd love to just move into like, what can we do as university people, and recognizing that, Tristan, you're not necessarily, you're not stuck in that weird complexity that we are, but and I want to start with students because sometimes we think, what can students do? And I want to give some concrete examples of forms of land back. And one of them is, a group I work with, they're called Sogorea Te. I guess I should put that in the chat. And they are, as far as I know, the first Native women's run land trust in an urban area. They've been around for quite some time under this name, and they've been around even longer under or other names. And then, of course, there's the Indigenous past, which is time immemorial. But, they have this term they call land rematriation instead of land back, right? And people, because it makes you stop and ask, like, what is that? Whereas when you say land back, people like, they already know what that is. And so they can't imagine it, right? They're like, oh, that's property. But they say that's restoring right relationship to land and peoples, and these are Indigenous relations. And I think our students are doing that here. So as an example, we work with Dr. Stanley Rodriguez. He's the president of Kumeyaay Community College. So Kumeyaay is the name of our the nation whose university we're built on. And our students build Tule Reed canoes with Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Stan, as we call him. And we've launched them, and we've gotten coastal access and Mission Bay access for these canoes. And that's a form of land back, right? It is transforming our relationships, but also potentially transforming stewardship over these lands. And then because of these students' work, we partner with institutions are changing. So like Birch Aquarium is involved, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, our natural reserve system. So we still own all these lands that are reserve lands here, that are sort of conservation lands. And so I was just there earlier this month, February 1st, I think, and they were, creating all these names in language, in Kumeyaay language and Ipai language throughout the reserve as part of this Wetlands Day. So there's important work that students do. I think students work, speak to our hearts. I think in terms of faculty, there's research, and I'm so lucky to be part of joining some of these folks in the School of Public Health. I'll put their names in the chat too. There's Professor Wael Delemi and Professor Linda Green. Wael is working on a climate change center, which he's already been doing, and he's already been doing that in collaboration with tribal communities. And so how do we imagine learning from Indigenous tribes about fire, right? And so something Cheg, he's always been working with Wael for several years now, these massive fires in Southern California, or today we have flooding because we don't have the infrastructure for light rain here, so our roads are flooded. How do we adjust to climate change, and how do we learn from Indigenous people in doing so? So that's something researchers can do at the university that has a benefit to the communities we partner with. And then finally, I guess at the level of foundations and people who have access to money, there are multiple ways to do land back. So, I'm lucky to work with a few foundations, Previs Foundation, Robert Woods Johnson, I'm blanking on one of them that Eve and I work with really closely. I apologize if I remember, I'll come back to that. But one of the things we're working with the Super Collective, which is, I saw that's in the chat. We call it Super Collective because it's a collective of land-based collectives around North America. And a number of them have started land back projects. And so we're sharing knowledge across these collectives on how is land back working out for you? How did it happen? What are the contradictions? And we have everything from people going and buying land themselves with the backing of a wealthy settler, and we have people, going out in New York State. We had a group that was working with agriculture farmers, primarily white farmers who are like, we don't really farm anymore. What are we going to do with this? And trying to restore land that way. And then we have the example of Sogorea Te, where the city actually has given some land back, which is, I think, the first that we know of a municipality doing such a thing. And so we have some structures being built, ceremonial structures and educational structures that we haven't seen in 200 years. And then we have small businesses offering backyards or gardens and things like that. And all these are forms of land back. And And I think it's like Tristan said, is if we can imagine it, right? That's, you know, until I participated in these things, I didn't think land back I thought it was just like a nice phrase, you know, but it's a real set of work that we can all participate in.
Yeah, my poet brain is just firing everywhere with the sort of constellation of associations and possibilities. But one thing that's tying these together for me is really the limits of our imagination. And it reminds me of a class I had, or a recent conversation I had in my native lit class on a defense of difficult poetry, which is a little bit of a stretch. And I'm only going to take a small plug here for read more poetry, read more difficult poetry. Indian Girls Book Club is a great resource for finding Indigenous Native authors as their work is coming out, but it's related to this limits of imagination, right? It's opening ourselves up to active participation in the conversation and active unpacking of these perhaps wild ideas and leaps in imagination. I love to hear all of the different ways that then can also apply to land back in terms of just access to space as well, and thinking about how that can be implemented in the classroom through just how we approach spaces differently, right? How do we approach the formal classroom? How do we approach the backyard garden? How do we approach that swath of land, kind of parkland in the middle of campus, right? How do we bring different intentions to these different places? And how might, for me, and as sort of daily practice, just something as simple as holding class outside, being in land in a different way of being than just sort of charting from class A to class B, how does that open up new sort of possibilities and new imaginations? I also want to so I love all of the sort of limits of imagination and how universities can help facilitate that, and hearing what individuals and students are doing. But I think tying both of what you were saying together, there are some interesting questions coming up in the chat as well that I want to sort of weave into this, especially as we were talking about the ways in which universities are capitalizing on those trust lands and those sort of resource extractions, and perhaps looking for a little bit more positive news as well. We have a question. UMass Amherst burned coal for 8 decades and today remains the largest public source of carbon emissions in Massachusetts. The UMass system also uses some of the world's dirtiest banks, insurers, and asset managers. In 2022, UMass Amherst pledged to be carbon zero by 2032, but it is now walking back that commitment. What would it look like for UMass to atone for these contributions to climate destruction, to Indigenous and non-Indigenous dispossession, and to all the other impacts of carbon emissions? Are there any positive examples of colleges or universities from which we can draw inspiration? And I think you've both touched a little bit on this already in terms of different colleges and collectives returning land and repurposing land in this way. And Tristan, also the idea that our biggest barrier to following through on these commitments might just be the limits of our imagination. But to give credit to that very well thought out and researched question, if there's anything further you have to add or any other specific examples come to mind of additional possibilities.
Oh, geez. So how do you make up for that? You know, I guess I can't think of anything off the top of my head about universities really sort of making those kind of histories right, especially in terms of like oil and gas or carbon. I mean, obviously, like not using those banks or not investing in those are starts. You know, making sure that you've got programs that are teaching people how to sort of like think about a green future as part of it too. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I work for a climate outlet. So, I mean, we read the science, we look at it, you know, we know that we're getting to a point where we're not talking about like necessarily atoning for like past wrongs anymore. It's about we're now getting to a point of where like we have to stop now, or we face the very, very serious consequences. So I would actually say making up for that past in terms of like oil and gas and fossil fuel burning and production. I don't know. Part of me thinks that maybe that's something to like put on the side for the moment to make them actually stop engaging with that sort of economy altogether first. Not that that is not an important thing to do as well, but you know, the science is here. We know what's happening over the next like what the next 20 years look like. And this is probably the role in which universities could have a large role in, is preventing the worst effects of climate change, by training the next generation of people to think differently about what the future can look like. So I don't know if that's helpful. That's the cynical side of me that I mentioned earlier. So
No, well, one, I love not being the most cynical in the room for once. Note to self, invite a climate scientist to the next party. But also I really appreciated you know, the thinking there of, oh gosh, the thought just left my brain. Oh, the thinking of practical ways that universities can help, right? What are universities for? And thinking about the history of land grant institutions, as so many of these were actually designed as agricultural schools, and they were meant to be sort of a utilitarian, practical, come to this college to learn these very practical skills, learn the latest technology in farming and agriculture. And I'm not sure how humanities got carried in with that through the back door, as always, I'm sure, but I'm glad they did. But I'm thinking too about how in the curriculum, we can return to those origins of, right, how to make this education accessible and relevant and also challenging and also aware of the humanities as it informs a different way of relating and being in relation to the land. And so yeah, I liked how that brings all of those together while also acknowledging that we just have to do the thing. Wayne, did you want to add any more to that particular?
Yeah, I appreciate the cynicism. I feel like I'm supposed to play the role of the optimistic settler right now. So I'll try, but I'll just say, yeah, I think because universities are contradictory things, and I think many of us have love-hate relationships with them. If we're not, we're probably not thinking, right? It's but one of our mentors, Pedro Noguera, he's a big writer in education. When we were students of his, we would express our skepticism, and he'd say, yeah, schools. And we're talking about all schooling, and something Che Glowry, and he's not the only person to say this, but he says is education has been weaponized against Indigenous people. So then how do we understand school, right? And so I think many of us share that same sentiment from whatever communities and backgrounds we may have come from. So we always used to express this, and Pedro would say, he's like, yeah, schools are not democratic, but they're the most democratic institutions we have. Right. And I think that that's the contradiction of schooling. And I think from an optimistic point of view, we should give a little grace to universities, which are being fundamentally attacked right now. Right. But having said that, I think contradictory institutions have temporary value. Right. And I think we have something to learn from Native nations that have invested in tribal gaming. Right. It's like nobody thinks of casinos as like liberation, but clearly this has created the possibilities, the economic possibilities for Indigenous futures, and people have decided to engage that. And some communities have said, we're going to do this for only so long, and we're going to do this, and we're going to invest in this way. And I feel like we can, I believe that we do and we can turn universities to do the right thing. It's like and you turn a bit at a time while trying to redirect this giant ship that's really this giant, this huge warship, if you will. But how do you create all the life rafts and other things to do other things? How do you train the divers to do other things? How do we learn how to swim? And that's a weird metaphor, but I think that's where I'm going. So having said that, I want to say some things about our university that are hopeful. And I don't want to say we're a good actor, although I'm sort of obligated to say that because I am an administrator right now in transparency. So, so one of, Karina Gold, who is the founder of Segoria Te, I asked her not that long ago, like, hey, if you could design any university program, what would it be? And she said, Wayne, what we really need is we need people, Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people who are trained in both respecting and learning and forwarding Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ecological knowledge in particular, but also policy on land and property and how that world works. And people who have those two trainings, that's who we need right now. And so inspired by her, I'm working with faculty, we're trying to turn our environmental studies minor into a major, into something that does that, into something that does planning, and something that would be a pathway for Native students who want to come, but also for non-Native students who want to do something about the world. We are the first university, to my knowledge, that we have passed a university-wide climate change education requirement. I was very lucky to be part of that. And that has a humanities component. It was understood from the faculty and the students who participate in this that it's not about like the science of it all, although that's certainly part of it. It's not about our technological hopes that we will tech our way out of climate change. It's understanding the humanistic and social dimensions of climate change. And it's kind of like Asa Hilliard used to always say, there's no technical solutions to political problems, right? And so we have to have that humanities and social dimension to it. We are the university that created climate science. So we know how much carbon is in the atmosphere because of the Keeling curve, and that started at our Oceanography Institute before we were even a university. It's the oldest, longest data set around climate change in the world. And having said all that, we burn fossil fuel. We have a power plant on campus, right? And you can bet we're invested in all kinds of things, right? Faculty vote to divest. There's all these efforts to do that. And I think, but at even an individual level, then what do we do next? Do we all invest in lithium? Because lithium is highly extractive and destructive. We are sitting on top of a $10 trillion lithium mining extraction project here in the Salton Sea, which is indigenous lands here. It's an ancient ocean, inland ocean, and we're just going to destroy that area to get lithium so that we can drive Teslas, and somehow we think that's going to solve the climate crisis. So I just don't know if anyone knows the simple technological answer or capitalist answer, but I think we have to keep driving at what we can. Yeah, that didn't sound that hopeful at the end, but hand it back to you. Oh, you're muted.
Yep.
Okay.
First time I knew it happened one of these times. No, that makes so much sense. And it was just fortuitous timing that I was presenting to an association of retired faculty here on UMass yesterday and sort of co-opted my talk on poetics into decolonizing genre through hybrid pieces. And specifically, I focused on Indigenous performance poetics as a way of real community building. And so I guess I will have one more plug for the poets. Happy to do a community workshop. Want to turn, with the time we have left, I want to turn some of these great questions coming in the chat, a couple that I really want to get to, but one that's following perhaps on what you just said, Wayne, making sure that this is still relevant to following what you just said. But Massachusetts now provides free community college for most residents of the Commonwealth. It's fantastic and shows where a good imagination can lead. I teach at one, says this person who posted the question, and my students are reading Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism. And I will put that in the chat as well. They have many questions about Liboiron's writing about good relations. What can I, a settler on a campus with 0 Indigenous faculty, do to help them and myself in developing these ways of being without appropriating practices in the way that Liboiron and others warn against? And I apologize, I am sure I am mispronouncing that name. I was gonna say I could open it to Wayne or Tristan. I think this idea of how we incorporate Indigenous knowledge without appropriation is also sometimes perhaps an excuse, but also a concern, how to do these things respectfully as well.
Yeah, I'm so lucky to know Max. And you know, so first I'm gonna end with quoting with Max because I think Max has provided some guidance. But I also think doing things without appropriation. I mean, can we? I think that we can fail forward on this and we can stumble. And it's not just settlers who do this. Indigenous people are always like, did I screw that up? You know, it's just like whether it's in your home community or not, it's just like we're always screwing up. And so we're asking for forgiveness and a bit of grace and to have the courage to do it, you know, and to have the humility to so it's worse to not try, right? So just an encouragement to to learn and apologize for always being a learner, and learners are imperfect. I think Max has this great, and Max has given me permission to say this before, so I'm assuming that permission still holds. But Max has a book that hasn't been written yet, but they're really funny because they're like, it's all in the title, and the title is "Do Your Chores," right? And it's basically just learn your responsibilities and do them, right, around the place you live. And that's like do your chores, and that's the best thing we can do, whether or not there are always on campuses with Native people who have the energy to have to educate us. Like I think we can learn our chores, and so I feel like you know, on our campus, just as an example of that, like look, I'm Asian, right? And I'm not in Asian American studies, and there is a reason. The reason I'm not in Asian American Studies is not because I don't respect that field. I deeply respect it. I don't. I read in it, but because I've been learning my chores, and so my chores have brought me to Black Studies and Indigenous Studies, and I read a lot on my own. I read Max's work, and then I try to organize people, whether or not they're Native or Black in these particular cases, to also co-organize together. And then next thing you know, it's like suddenly like you know, you build a lot of community that way. So I think that you know, non-Native people, we have an obligation to organize non-Native people, and that's good work. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I simple do your chores. I think sometimes we overcomplicate the solution. Here's one responding to the political landscape that we've been sort of dancing around here. Some universities are trying to get rid of land acknowledgements entirely. Can tribes hold land-grant universities accountable to the land acknowledgements? This is a fun question. There are a lot of fun metaphors online about the shortcomings of land acknowledgements, but I think this also gets into a larger anxiety about what the relationship and dependency and obligations between universities and federal governments, universities and funding. We're seeing that even in literary journals who get funding from the National Endowment of the Arts, and ways in which that is sort of beholden to the political whims of the time. And so for land grant universities, yeah, can tribes hold them accountable to land acknowledgements, and how should we maybe be preparing for a changing landscape?
I mean, I guess I could start. I think, yeah, I think in the years since our reporting has come out around land grab and work afterwards, this similar questions like this have come up a lot about what can tribes do. Not under the opinion that it's up to the tribes to hold the universities responsible for their actions. It's the universities, right? Like, and it's the people who make up that university. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the political climate we're in is, I mean, none of us have experience with this. We're off the map of experience when it comes to dealing with the politics that are happening these days, essentially on some level. Obviously, a lot of history can inform how we do that, but generally in our day-to-day lives, we haven't had to deal with this kind of stuff before. But I think when it comes to, again, universities, it's up to universities. If they actually do care about the relationships that they have with their students, with tribes, with land, with anything for that matter, it's up to them to sort of hold themselves accountable and, you know, kind of stick to their guns on stuff, no matter how hard it gets. And it's getting hard and will stay harder. But you know, it's it's really an expression of your values and morals, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just give an example of that. So like, here's a book by Andrew Hersher. Oops, sorry, can someone put that in the chat? So, you know, this is the history of University of Michigan, which promised the Anishinaabe people that this was their university. What's amazing is that, you know, Professor Hersher found this and published it. And Professor Hersher, you know, is a settler professor at University of Michigan, and I do think, yeah, we should hold our institutions accountable. You know, land acknowledgements are, you know, what are they? With my also with my colleague Teresa Ambo, who I mentioned earlier, we actually wrote a piece on land acknowledgements, mostly borrowing from people in the Canadian setting who've been dealing with it much longer. And you know, Hayden King and Chelsea Vowell, they both kind of say they're a beginning. They're not the only beginning, and they're certainly not the end, right? And I don't think anyone thinks that. But one thing is, like, you know, we should be personally doing land acknowledgements, not like reciting the one that's on the university website, but sort of saying, you know, I acknowledge that I'm on Kumeyaay land. What are my obligations? What are my chores? And I think if we do them collectively, it doesn't matter what the formal statement is on the university. And I think that's what we're hoping these land acknowledgements would do. We're hoping that people with formal authority in universities would, the next question is like, now that I've acknowledged the land, what are my chores, right? So, but I think we can all do that ourselves. I just remembered to the two foundations that that I'll somehow tie this in, but the William T. Grant Foundation and Lumina Foundation is also two more that I've been fortunate to work with, or some of our colleagues have worked with. And what I really appreciate about them is they're learning foundations. They're not like, we're just going to fund you because we think these are the right answers. We're funding you because we want to ask you what are the right answers. And they're doing this particularly with Native scholars and communities. Again, I think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has like been a superstar in that respect. And I think that's what institutions can do, is like, how can we learn from Native people instead of saying, oh, we're here to save Native tribes or whatever. And the land acknowledgements were meant to get us there. So we can still do that work with or without a formal statement on the website.
I think this next question gets a little bit to that idea too of moving beyond these sort of finger pointing assignments of responsibility. We have in the chat, or in the Q&A, sorry. I work at a nonprofit food and farming justice and sovereignty organization. The organization owns and stewards a 121-acre farm that we know is unceded Nonotuck, Nipmuc, and Pocumtuck lands. We are discussing rematriation, but also as, quote, an alternative, reparative actions that serve Black farmers and others who have been harmed by the industrialized food system. Are land grab universities any more responsible for repairing and rematriating the land on which they sit than every other piece of land in this country, all of which is stolen with a bloody colonial history? How's that for a no holds bar?
Sorry, so the last bit of that question was just what responsibility the universities have to rematriate land that they're on?
I guess it's thinking, make sure I'm not muted. I guess it's thinking in terms of, are land grant universities more responsible for repairing and rematriating the land on which they sit than every other piece of land in this country? So a lot of the focus of our conversation has been on land grant institutions as sort of the framing, but I think tying with what Wayne was just saying about the possibilities for personal accountability, are land grant universities any more responsible than other institutions or other uses of land or trust lands that could also be rematriated?
I mean, I don't, if there's a rating system here, then no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think there's sort of like a, if I'm understanding, hope forgive me if I'm wrong in understanding, is that like one person or organization is more obligated to make returns than another. Generally, that sort of Olympics of oppression Olympics kind of a thing isn't really, I don't think is particularly helpful. I think it is sort of like that institution, that organization, that person's sort of moral obligation to do that. That said, if anybody is most responsible for having to return land, it's probably the United States, just generally writ large. So we can just put that right at the top of the list if you really want to go there. But you know, I think this is really, again, you know, when we're thinking about what you do with this information, again, I think it's really trying to sort of stress, like, sit down, get out on the land and think about sort of like what makes a difference here, what would make a difference, like, you know, what are the craziest ideas that you can come up with in terms of rematriation, in terms of land return, etc. There are a lot of different factors that are obviously involved with this, and a lot of different features that you can have with it. But you know, again, if your institution is not one that actually cares about these particular issues or ideas, it changes the tactics that you have to deal with and the ways in which you engage with that institution, right? Some institutions are much more open to these conversations, others will not have it at all. And I think there's not a one sort of blanket, one size fits all in these situations. So yeah. Wayne, you probably have a smarter answer than I
No,
do.
I don't, but I will just say, just vibing off what you're saying is like, yeah, imagine the craziest idea and the funnest idea. Like, I actually think this work is quite joyful. I mean, part of the reason we started with canoes is because they're fun and Dr. Stan is funny. It's just a good way to go. I don't know if guilt is the answer, and culpability in a sense is part of guilt. And I'm not saying like we should wash our hands of things. I just think, you know, going back to land acknowledgements, it's like some of them are quite solemn, you know. And I think it's more interesting to be like, yeah, so you know, how do we see this as a point of joy? How do we understand all our relationships different? How do we imagine a better future for people unborn, right? It's like, so they don't have to deal with this the same way. Yeah, so going back to this 120 acres, I mean, that's amazing. And I also think the answer is probably not simple, right? And it, you know, and I think sometimes out of guilt, we're looking for like the immediate solution to a 200-year-old problem, right? It's like we're looking for returning right relationship. And you know, we've seen examples of people being like, oh, well, I just want to give this up so I can move on and not be guilty. And it's kind of like, you know, can we just not operate with like trying to address guilt and let's build the future together. And I think that's fun. And I just want to emphasize that is fun.
Well, I'm glad you bring our attention to that, as someone who is often also the most cynical in the room. But even just thinking about, we started this evening with the Feinberg lecture series version of a land acknowledgement, which on the one hand struck me for its audacity of saying the thing, right? Saying that we, you know, the killing and the making of refugees, and the language just being more colorful, perhaps, than the official UMass land acknowledgement that was developed with the Native Advisory Committee and with tribes in the area, so has some input, but begins it acknowledges genocide, but it also begins in gratitude with the land. And in listening to what you're saying about not forgetting that these things can be joyful and these things can also feel good, is how it begins with we begin in gratitude, and that we is not differentiated from the university or the indigenous communities or the people. That we allows for a settler engagement of gratitude with the land. And it does invite settlers to also reposition themselves in how they relate to the land and how they relate to their responsibility and kinship and understanding. I'm struck too, I think worth bringing in this conversation is the focus that we started this conversation in the university's capacity. I think whether or not the university has more responsibility than other institutions, I think this is kind of a good sort of summation of everything that's been said too, in terms of what we can do to not just feel helpless, and it's understanding these varying capacities. And so understanding that universities might have greater capacity. Some universities might have greater capacity than others. Individuals within that university might have capacity. So thinking of the educators in the room, thinking of what is your individual capacity to foster these relationships and to start these conversations that perhaps recognize guilt and own culpability, but don't stop there. Recognizing that discomfort as a necessary point of departure for how do we write these relationships, and recognizing that it's an ongoing process. So I'm thinking even just in terms of the small ways that I run my literature seminars. I don't do final papers because I don't want the focus to be on some sense of completion and summation of knowledge, and now I've shut the books on this topic and now I'm moving on, but focusing more on the process throughout the semester, developing conversations, drawing connections across texts, and really emphasizing the fact that knowledge is not static, and that we can have these questions that come up. And so reevaluating the sort of rigid fixity of our sort of approach to knowledge and facts and learning, as rather than something that we sort of complete, being something that we're perpetually engaging in. We are down to the last few minutes here. And so I think a lot of the questions coming up have more or less been addressed, but in light of sort of getting to these closing conversations, something here is, what are the most promising strategies for pressuring our institutions to pay reparations for the harms they have caused or contributed to? And does the global nature of carbon emissions and climate destruction make this fight easier or harder than other reparation struggles? So sort of giving a last minute option of closing out, closing comments, and promising strategies.
I mean, I'll start very quickly. I mean, I think Abigail and Wayne, y'all can talk more about this in depth in terms of like being inside the institution, but from where I'm sitting and where I've seen the most movement, the most effective strategies are people coming into community with each other and talking to each other. Nothing changes at these institutions, as far as I can tell, without a groundswell of people who care about the issue, want to work on the issue, and come together to do so. And I think the biggest problem that I see a lot of the times is that for your institution you have people churning in and out very, very quickly. So it really puts you in a pressure cooker to sort of like do this kind of work, but it still is all community based. It's people talking to each other, having conversations, and making those conversations bubble up through the institution. That's always been the most effective way of I think any place in any situation is people coming together. Because if that doesn't happen, there's no basis to work off of.
Thank you.
Can I go next so you can have the last word, Abigail?
Mine might be more simple than you think, but absolutely.
I really like what you said, Tristan. I feel like Yeah, I'm really interested in lately watching, reading books and movies without antagonists and protagonists. I think it's really an interesting, different way of storytelling. Um, and I think about like, I had one of my former students, Aries Umel, who was at the DAPL pipeline stuff at, what was it called, Mini-Wachoni. And, what was so interesting about that movement was things like, all these military veterans showing up. I mean, of course, many are native, but many are non-native people to show up, and people who have fought in wars, who have, many people who've had to kill other people, and to show up and to defend the land, right? And to talk about that. And what does it mean to build relationship, to invite people in, to heal ourselves, right? And I think that's a different, that's something I'm not saying like all Native people are nice all the time whatsoever, right? But I do think there's a certain kind of methodology to kinship making that we see from a number of Native communities, if not all, that is very different than our current theories of how social change happens, which is like, we're going to go and, rally around somebody and make them do something, right? It's really inviting people to understand how we're in relationship, and I have a lot of hope in that. I think that's the methodology.
Thank you. And I want to end just on highlighting that idea of kinship making, just even taking apart the semantics, the syntax of that phrase, right? It's ongoing. It's not a passive relationship. It's not a passive state of being. It takes effort, it takes work, but it also kinship, right? It can be joyful, it can be sad, it can be sorrowful, it can be grieving, and it can be powerful. It can be all of these things. So Koyana Shinak, thank you both so much for your time this evening. I, for one, have loved this conversation and opportunity to think specifically about how these large topics might be addressed in the university at both the institution level and also the individual level as well. So thank you for your time.